we shall commence this module by talking about the major crisis of 1991. India went through a major economic crisis in 1991 due largely to fiscal and balance of payment problems. This forced the government to resort to borrowings from the IMF, which came with its associated package of conditionalities compromising liberalization and opening up of the economy, privatization, currency depreciation and control of fiscal and current account deficits. Liberalization in its simplest form is the removal of government restrictions on economic activity both in the domestic and in the international sphere. In response to this crisis, the government unleashes forces of globalization and liberalization in the form of the new economic policy of 1991, also known as the NEP. The NEP was made up of the components of the Washington Consensus with the aim to achieve a more open and integral economy and the use of market forces to allocate the resources efficiently. The forced withdrawal of the state from all spheres of economic activity was designed to assign an increased role to the private sector in directly productive activities, thus confining the state to the provision of social overhead capital and education and health. This decline in the role of public sector in productive activities was achieved through privatization of the PSEs and disinvestment of the shareholding of the public sector in the PSEs or PSUs. After studying this module, you shall be able to understand the context of privatization and disinvestment in India, appreciate the role of private and public sectors in India, understand post-1991 reforms in terms of disinvestment and privatization, familiarize with different modes of privatization, develop a critical view of disinvestment and privatization in Indian context. Let us now begin our discussion about the role of public and private sectors in India. Industrial policy resolutions of 1948 and 1956 defined the roles of public and private sectors in India in the context of a mixed economy model. The heavy and basic capital good industry were reserved for the public sector and the consumer goods industry was in the hands of the private sector. The motivation behind the establishment of the two sectors, public and private sectors, was very different. The private sector was guided by the objective of profit maximization vis-a-vis social welfare objective of the public sector along with the viable and sustainable operations. The public sector covered the projects which were generally natural monopolies, had low profitability with goods of public goods nature, infrastructure projects and activities involving long gestation period. The area of natural monopoly with concerns for scale economies were in the hands of the public sector due to largely to avoid concentration of economic power in the hands of the private sector. On the other hand, private sector investment was primarily in the areas of quick profits. Hence, the former was more of the autonomous nature, whereas the latter was more of the induced investment. Public sector also expected to promote balanced regional development and help in conserving the scarce foreign exchange under the ISI strategy followed by the export promotion. It also plays an important role in providing secure employment to around 15 lakh workers in central PSEs in 2009. The government sector operates through the public sector enterprises known as PSEs. The number of PSEs in India has increased from 5 to 246 between 1951 and 2009. The star PSEs include HMT, BHEL, ONGC, SAIL, etc. However, the performance of these enterprises has not been satisfactory. The measurement of public sector performance in terms of profits can generate is incorrect, as these enterprises were not set up with the objective of making profits. Low profitability is seen as low return on investment or capital, thus leading to the fiscal problems. Alternatively, the value of sales should be used as a performance indicator. Measurement of efficiency of PSEs using the profits as a criteria is incorrect. Rather, the use of social marginal productivity with the utility of a project gauged on the basis of its contribution to the national income, distribution and balance of payment is considered more appropriate. Hence, a social cost benefit analysis is more relevant. The problem of low productivity faced by the PSEs means low resources for further investment and sustained growth. The main reasons for low productivity of the PSEs are: first, the pricing policy. The pricing policy of the PSEs is based more on the public utility approach than on the ROR approach. The former approach is based on no profit, no loss criteria, and the use of administered prices implies the prices are subject to price ceilings. This results in allocative inefficiency with its spillover into the private sector. Distortions in prices leads to a diversion of profits toward the private sector and affects the workers' morale. The ROR approach is adopted by some PSEs as the right principle for determining the prices in PSEs. However, the ROR cannot be uniform for all PSEs. The problem area is not the central PSEs, but the various utilities and infrastructure service with inadequate pricing and poor recovery of user charges, especially in the SEBs and railways and road transport corporations. There has been a decline in the revenue cost ratio over time. A revision in the pricing policy announced is based more on the market based instruments than on the command control instruments, especially for chemicals, fertilizers, steel, etc. The principle of LRMC based prices has now been adopted for PSEs. Second, underutilization of capacity. At times, capacity utilization as a proportion of created capacity is less than 50%. Moreover, the products produced are of poor quality. Third, overmanning and rigid production capacities. This leads to the wastage of resources. The political considerations to keep employment intact also plays a critical role in overstaffing. Fourth, the operation of the PSEs are subject to ad hocism design to meet the demand shortfalls in the short term. In general, projects get delayed by an average of almost 2 years, which in turn is responsible for cost escalations. Moreover, the technology used is generally imported, which in turn is tied with foreign suppliers, such that the PSEs are forced to use their technology and materials despite better and cheaper alternatives being available. Fifth, in the name of regional development, PSEs are set up in remote or backward areas with poor infrastructure and other backward linkages. This leads to cost escalation. Sixth, sometimes the PSEs also take over the sick and loss-making private sector units and try to keep them going primarily to safeguard employment and avoid any layoffs. Seventh, political and bureaucratic interventions in decision making. The PSEs ought to be accountable, yet they need the freedom in decision making, especially regarding on the spot and in routine matters. Sound policy would comprise target setting, marking out of the functional limits and organize efficient working. On the one hand, it is pointed that the PSUs fall behind the private sector in terms of technological and overall efficiency, while on the other hand, their autonomy is substantially restricted due to the political interference. Moving on to discuss the post-1990 reforms, disinvestment and privatization. The period after 1991 saw the adoption of NEP 1991, which comprised, among other things, privatization and disinvestment in PSEs as a part of broader liberalizations program unleashed in the Indian economy. Some of the stylized facts are presented below. First, reduction in the number of industries reserved for the public sector from 17 IPR 1956 to 8 in 1991 to 3 in 2001, atomic energy, mineral related to atomic energy and railways. Second, disinvestment of shares of PSEs to raise the resources. Third, signing of MOUs beginning in 1987 to 88 with 4 MOUs to encourage an arm's length relationship between the PSEs and the ministries. These MOUs set targets and provide operational autonomy. By 2008 to 9, 144 PSEs has signed the MOUs. Fourth, attempt to deal with sickness the same way as in the case of the private sector. BFIR to consider either restructuring of a sick unit or its close down. This was coupled with offer of a voluntary retirement scheme known as VRS to its employees to shed the excess manpower. Fifth, the policy of Navratnas and Mini Ratnas. 18 PSEs have been given the status of Navratnas and 62 central PSEs have been classified as Mini Ratnas. The BODs of the Navratnas have been given extra power to facilitate them to become global players. They have the operational freedom and autonomy in entering the joint ventures, organizational restructuring, raise the capital from domestic and international markets and set the financial joint ventures. Let us first understand what disinvestment is. Disinvestment implies the sales of public sector's equity to a private investor. It also includes a reduction in capital expenditure or the decision of not replenishing the capital goods. In India, the functioning of many PSEs has been a contentious issue. It is argued that the PSUs are characterized by low productivity, poor quality of products, overmanning, inadequate human resource development and low return on capital, and hence these PSUs or PSEs sold be handed over to the private sector to improve their functioning and profitability. Disinvestment involves the sale of equity and bond capital and securitization of loan capital of PSEs. Disinvested shares are listed and traded in the stock market. Disinvestment can take either of the three forms: minority or majority disinvestment or complete privatization. The former allows the government to retain more than 51% share in the company, which allows the management control. Minority sale can be through action or an offer for sale, like in the case of NTPC and Power Grid Corporation of India Limited. Under majority disinvestment, the government sells a majority share or stake either to other central PSEs or to the private enterprises. The examples of majority disinvestment include the sale of Madras Refineries Limited and Bongaigaon Refinery and Petrochemicals, that is BRPL, to Indian Oil Corporation and Kochi Refinery Limited to Bharat Petroleum Corporation. Complete disinvestment is when 100% control is passed on to the private buyer. Example of complete privatization includes the sale of 18 hotels of the ITDC. Hence, disinvestment differs from privatization in that the former involves dilution of ownership and not transfer of full ownership to the private investor. Disinvestment thus can be termed as partial privatization. Post 1991, the Government of India resorted to phased disinvestment, resulting in an increased presence of private sector in most production activities. The three phases in which disinvestment was planned are: first, phase 1, 1991-92 to 1995-96. The aim was to disinvest up to 20% and broad-based equity, improve the management and increase the resources for PSEs. Up to July 1991, 18 industries were reserved for the public sector, which was reduced to only 8 after July 1991. In the first tranche of the disinvestment in December 1991, 31 PSEs were grouped on the basis of net assets value per share, and bids were invited from 10 financial institutions and mutual funds. In February 1992, the National Renewal Fund was set up to protect the workers' interest and provide a safety net for them. Phase 2, from 1996-97 to 1997-98. Public Sector Disinvestment Commission was set up under G.V. Ramakrishna for a period of 3 years with the aim to prepare a long-term disinvestment program for PSEs. Third, phase 3, from 1998 to 99 to 2007-2008. This phase was marked by a reduction in government shareholding in PSEs to 26% to facilitate ownership changes. A Department of Disinvestment was set up in December 1999. The priority for disinvestment would be those PSEs which could lead to large revenues and where disinvestment could be implemented with least impediments in short time. It was in this period that the shares of GAIL, VSNL, Concord, IOC and ONGC were offered for sale, followed by Balco, BRPL and Chennai and Kochi refineries in 2000-2001. In 2001-2002, strategic sales were effected in CMC, IBP, VSNL and PPL along with 8 hotels of the ITDC. Sale of Maruti Udyog Limited registered an overwhelming response. Fourth, phase 4 is the period after 2007 to the current period. The companies lined up for divestment includes RITES, NHPC, Oil India, Coal India, Public Sector Banks and the Central Bank of India. In 2009, the government approved disinvestment up to 5% of equity out of government shareholding in NTPC and Rural Electrification Corporation Limited REC via the public offer. For REC, a fresh equity issued of 15% was also approved. Disinvestment up to 10% in Satluj Jal Vidyut Nigam and 8.38% in NMDC Limited via public offers was also undertaken. All these are according to the Rastogi and Shukla 2013 study. The logic or rationale behind disinvestment is to meet the budgetary needs, improve efficiency, reduce the fiscal deficit, raise funds for technological upgradation, modernize and expansion of PSUs, and raise funds for VRS. The aim is to reduce government's equity in non-strategic PSEs 26% or less or shut down the SIC units. Thus, the twofold objective is to inculcate the financial discipline and promote efficiency. The former is more of a fiscal convenience than undertake managerial reform, encourage voluntary retirement and ensure increased autonomy. The two concepts of privatization of Indian PSEs and disinvestment are two sides of the same coin. Problems in the process of disinvestment. First, number of bidders has been small even for the more profitable PSEs. Second, the government has pushed the financial institutions and the mutual funds to invest in the equity of the PSEs. Third, insider trading has led to the underpricing and low valuation of equity. Fourth, there is apprehension disinvestment means crowding out the private sector from the primary capital market. Fifth, the process has been less open and transparent and does not have a national consensus as the funds in PSEs belongs to the people. Sixth, the argument in favor of efficiency and profitability is disinvested are not borne out by the facts. Seventh, a strong presence of a public sector in the form of PSEs was designed to provide the necessary checks and balances to rein in the corporate sector. Eighth, India lacks the institutional prerequisites for disinvestment to realize its objectives. Raising the resources to cover government's fiscal deficit is aptly put as selling the family silver, which is not sustainable. Critics thus advocate the complete privatization and strategic disinvestment compared to majority or minority disinvestment, as the government does not lose its control in the latter case. A greater challenge is to either turn around the loss-making PSEs or be able to sell them to the private sector. The NEP of 1991 began with the sale of minority stake in the PSUs. Subsequently, the focus has shifted to strategic sale of the identified PSUs. The government's disinvestment policy has been ad hoc and unstructured with no time frame. Let us now understand what privatization is. Privatization refers to the transfer of assets or functions performed in the public sector to the private sector. It is seen as a tool for enhancing competitive forces in the economy. It is also seen as an effective force for restructuring and reforming the PSEs. It can take different forms: franchising, leasing, delegation, contracting, displacement, and divestment. The last is the most significant form of privatization, as the ownership changes from public to private sector. Liberalization and deregulation, along with the well-developed capital markets, are the prerequisites for privatization to obtain increased productivity and profits. Rationale in favor of privatization. First, the assumption is that the private sector is profit-oriented, more efficient and has better performance with good quality management, which helps to modernize and diversify businesses. It allows the adoption of global best practices and technology. It further helps to raise performance benchmarks and promotes a responsible work culture. It also leads to a more efficient allocation of resources. Second, there need not be government accountability. Third, private sector enterprises are subject to capital market discipline. Fourth, no political intervention possible. Fifth, prompt decision making leads to exploitation of opportunities. Sixth, customer satisfaction is maximized. Privatization occurs via IPO's launch, strategic sale to domestic or foreign buyer, equal access voucher programs, management or employee buoyance. The argument against privatization are: first, it encourages monopoly power and a rise in prices with lower output. There is no room for promoting social objectives. Rather, it promotes corrupt and unfair ways of acquiring licenses and clinch business deals, thus promoting rent seeking and lobbying. Second, private sector is interested in buying profit-making enterprises only. Third, it is not interested in projects with long gestation periods, infrastructure and risky projects. Fourth, private sector does not have the access to funds like the public sector does. Fifth, PSEs do not have a competitive environment in which they can operate. Irrespective of the ownership, it is the competitive environment in which an enterprise operates which determines its efficiency. Moving on to discuss the modes of privatization. The government has followed two methods of disinvestment. First is the sale of share in select PSUs, followed between 1991-92 to 1998-99. And second is the strategic sale of a PSU to a private sector company through competitive bidding between 1999-2000 to 2003 and 4. After 2004, disinvestment has been primarily in terms of the sales of equity. Initially, in 1991, bundling approach was followed involving the sale of goods and not so good enterprises, but this did not yield much funds. This was followed by the auction method. In 1996-97, GDRs of VSNL and MTNL were resorted to, and in 1998-99, profitable PSEs like the ONGC, GAIL and IOC were made to cross-hold shares in other PSEs. Let us now understand the critique of privatization and disinvestment. First, undervaluation of assets. The CAG issued 3 reports in 1993, 2005 and 2006 which noted the underpricing of the assets of the PSEs, which led to the considerable loss to the government. The losses ranged from 127% for HPCL to 616% for NLC. Targets never met over the period between 1991-92 to 2009-2010, except in 1991-92, 1994-95, 1998-99 and 2003-2004. The initial success was due to extremely low price of bundles. In 1994-95, there was a major offloading of shares of profitable PSUs like BHEL, BP, CCI, EIL, GAIL, MTNL, etc. In the third year, it was more due to cross-buying of shares. In the last period, it was the sales of ONGC shares which helped exceed targets. In the remaining periods, poor realization of disinvestment revenues was due largely to the hasty, unplanned manner in which it was executed. The government did not create the necessary preconditions like listing of shares on the stock exchange, thus ignoring the linkage between PSEs and the capital market. No proper monitoring of the process adopted resulted in lower realization than warranted. Second, misuse of the funds realized from disinvestment. The Finance Minister in 1991 had announced the setting up of National Renewal Fund with the aim of using the proceeds from disinvestment for generating employment and education infrastructure. Third, loss of potential of employment generation. Reform in labour laws has been a major demand of the private sector post-liberalizations in 1991. This implies that the promise to keep the interest of the employees of these enterprises intact and encourage creation of employment opportunities has not been kept, and more so in case of firms sold to the foreign buyers. This has imposed a social cost on the poor, which has led to the unemployment and migration to the low productivity jobs. This has also reduced their overall welfare. Fourth, no guarantee that privatization leads to the promotion of competitive markets. There is no empirical correlation between the change in ownership from the public to the private sectors results in the improved perforce of the erstwhile PSEs. Thus, change in the ownership of an enterprise is not a precondition to its improved performance. Instead, it is the promotion of a competitive environment, be it between the public and the private sector, that results in allocative efficiency. Let us now conclude and summarize what we have learned in this module. Disinvestment and privatization are two interrelated concepts. In the context of post-1991 reforms in India, reduction in the role of the state to bare minimum has been orchestrated via selling the government's share in PSEs to the private sector or complete privatization. Thus, privatization is the final stage of disinvestment in PSEs, wherein the government gives up the complete control and the ownership to the private sector. The rationale for disinvestment and privatization finds support in profit and efficiency based arguments, but there has been not much empirical support for this contention. Rather, it is competitive environment in which firms perform that push them to be efficient and profitable, irrespective whether they are in public or the private sector.